This digital-only relationship between Renee and Braden continued for almost a year until January of 2012 when something horrible happened. Braden was in a horrible motorcycle accident. He survived the accident, but his passenger, his best friend, this guy named Richie, who was riding right on the back of his motorcycle, he didn't survive. He was killed in the accident. And it was determined that Braden was driving recklessly, and so he was charged with manslaughter and convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Even though Renee's mother, Teresa, was totally upset about this accident. I mean, she did understand someone had lost their life and now Braden was going to jail for 2 years. She understood the seriousness of this accident. But at the same time, there was a part of her, her motherly, protective side of her, was kind of relieved for her daughter. She figured with Braden being out of contact for 2 years in prison that their relationship would end and Renee could go pursue somebody else who was not an ex-boyfriend of a close friend and was someone that she could actually see in person and not just have to text with all the time. But surprisingly, after Braden was transferred to Goulburn Prison, which is where he'd be serving his 2-year sentence, it's located about 2 hours to the south of Sydney, his family smuggled a phone somehow into this jail, and he was able to continue texting with Renee. And so after he was incarcerated, they just picked up their relationship like nothing had changed. Now, Renee's family did not like this development, and they told her as much. They thought this was a bad idea, that this was the wrong path for her. But Renee didn't care. She was totally in love. And in fact, over the first couple of weeks that he was in Goulburn Prison, their relationship only intensified. They actually agreed to get married as soon as he was released at the end of 2013. And in fact, Renee had already begun making wedding preparations. She had gone on eBay and found this beautiful tiara she would wear on her wedding day. And she had contracted a wedding photographer. And she had even contacted the Greek consulate to ask if it would be okay if Braden were allowed to enter their country because they were planning to have their honeymoon in Greece and Braden was going to be a convicted felon, and so she needed permission for him. But in August of 2013, just 2 months before Braden's expected release date, something changed. Renee's mother, Teresa, got a text message from Braden, something she had never gotten before, and it said, "You need to check on your daughter. She's talking about killing herself." And so Teresa is totally taken aback by this message, and she goes right into Renee's bedroom where she is sitting on her bed, and her mother sits down next to her and says, "Honey, are you okay? You know, what's going on?" And Renee would look up at her mom and say, "Yeah, you know, I'm fine. What's going on with you?" And then Teresa would hold out the phone and show her the text message from Braden, and as soon as Renee saw it, she kind of sighed and looked at her mom and said, "I'm not going to hurt myself. We just broke up. Our relationship is over." Teresa knew this was going to be an extremely hard stretch of time for her daughter with another painful breakup here, but at the same time, Teresa thought to herself, this is probably for the best. That relationship just had bad news written all over it from the start, and so now she can begin to heal and move forward with her life. And so Teresa and Renee would sit in the room for a while just chatting on the bed, and then eventually Renee would tell her mom that her plans that night were to go out with her friends and cut loose and kind of just forget about this whole thing. And so Teresa sat in her bedroom on her bed as her daughter stood in front of the mirror and got ready. And then once Renee was ready, she and her mom hugged and kissed, and then Renee told her mom she'd be back soon, and then she left the house. A few hours later, Teresa received a text message from her daughter, and it started with, "Mom, I love you so much, and I'm sorry for the pain I'm about to cause you. You can still talk to me though, just call out my name and I'll be there." Teresa read this message and didn't really know what to make of it. She knew her daughter was almost certainly very upset about this breakup, but she didn't really understand the context of this message, and so she called her daughter. She didn't pick up, so she called her again, and after that second time her daughter didn't answer, she sent her a text message that just said, "Please call me back." But she sat there kind of waiting for her daughter's call, but it never came. And so Teresa, starting to feel a little bit worried about her daughter, she called Camilla and she asked her, "Hey, have you talked to Renee tonight? Because I can't get in touch with her." And Camilla would tell Teresa that actually, yeah, I just got a very strange text message from her that just said, "I love you, I'm sorry." And so at this point, the two women understood that there could be something very wrong with Renee, and so they met up and drove all around Sydney, going to all the places that Renee was known to go to. But after several hours of looking and not hearing back from Renee, they really didn't know what to do. And so the two women drove back to Teresa's house, so Renee's house, and they went inside and they sat down, and at that point, Teresa's husband and the rest of Renee's siblings, they were all there, and everyone's just kind of sitting around wondering what to do next, when around 9:30 at night, they heard a knock on the door. And it was the police coming to inform them that they had found Renee's car parked in an area that it shouldn't have been, but Renee wasn't there. And so they were coming to ask if they knew where she was and why her car might be out there. And so at this point, the family is totally terrified. They tell the police about these strange text messages, and then before long, the parents just rush outside, they hop in their cars, and they drive out to where their daughter's car is. And where Renee's car was parked was in an area called the Gap. It basically was this sheer cliff overlooking the ocean. The parents got out and they searched their daughter's car, but there was no sign of where she had gone based on the car. And so they began running up and down the cliffs. There was a sidewalk that kind of ran parallel to the edge of the cliff, and they're running up and down, hoping they're going to find their daughter, but there's no sign of her. And then at some point, Teresa climbed up to one of the highest points of the cliff. And when she got up there, she found her daughter's black flat shoes, and they were placed neatly together on the ground right in front of the fence that was there to prevent people from getting too close to the edge of the cliff. But despite an extensive search that night, they couldn't find any sign of Renee. She was nowhere to be found. However, the police would discover the following day that there was actually a camera that was looking at that section of the cliffs. And so they reviewed this footage and they found Renee. They saw what happened to her. And in this camera footage, you see Renee walking up the trail in the middle of the night, and she stops and she takes off her shoes and she puts them down, and then she hops over that fence. Now, the fence was not right up against the very edge of the cliff. It was set back maybe 3 or 4 feet. And so she hops over the fence, and then she steps very carefully to the edge of the cliff, and she kind of peeks over the edge and then looks visibly terrified, and she moves backwards a few steps until her back is pressed up against the fence. And then she pulls out her phone and she sends 3 text messages. One was to her mother, which is the text about how she loved her and she was sorry for the pain she was going to cause her. And then the other 2 text messages were to Camilla and also to Braden. However, to this day, we don't actually know what either of those text messages said. And then after sending these 3 text messages, Renee takes her phone and she throws it off the cliff into the water. And then she sat down and began kind of shimmying herself forward towards the edge. Now, the camera did not actually pick her up falling off the cliff, but it's assumed when she went out of frame that she had fallen off the cliff to her death. Her body would never be recovered. Renee's death was ruled a suicide. However, her family, in addition to being totally devastated by this horrible loss, they felt totally confused. They had no idea why this had happened, but they were certain it had to have something to do with this recent breakup with Braden Spiteri. And so they tried to get in touch with Braden, but he wasn't getting back in touch with them. And so the family contacted the police and said, can you reach out to the prison where he is and set up a meeting? And so the police obliged them and they called Goulburn Prison. And when they spoke to the prison, they said, who? Braden who? Yeah, we don't have a Braden Spiteri here. We never have. And the reason was, Braden Spiteri wasn't real. Renee's friend, Camilla, had made him up. He was a fictitious person. That picture of Braden Spiteri where Camilla is laying on his shoulder, that was just some random person she had met in a club. Camilla had always been very possessive of Renee ever since they had met in high school, and at some point, she had just decided that she wanted even more control over Renee. And so the first thing she did is she convinced Renee that her earlier boyfriend, the one she'd been dating for 2 years before Braden, she convinced Renee that he had been cheating on her the whole time, he was unfaithful, that he didn't love her, and then she had created those text messages and given them to Renee and convinced Renee that that was something he had said, and before long, Renee totally believed it. She approached her boyfriend, he denied it, but Camilla the whole time is telling Renee, he's lying to you, he's been doing this whole time, I know he's a bad guy. And so Renee had listened to her best friend and she had severed that relationship. And then almost immediately after that, Camilla swoops in to the rescue and connects Renee with this Braden guy, Camilla's supposed ex-boyfriend, who really was just Camilla on the other side of the phone. And for nearly 2 years, Camilla kept this charade up, and Renee completely believed this was a real person, that Braden was her boyfriend. She loved him. And eventually, in June of 2013, so 2 months before Renee died, she confided in Braden, aka Camilla, that her friend Camilla was toxic and mean and controlling, and she didn't want to be her friend anymore. And so Camilla, she's reading this and she's furious. And so she decides the only way to get revenge on Renee and regain control of her is to have Braden break up with her. And so 2 months later, on August 5th, 2013, so on the day that Renee died, she was out to lunch at around 1 p.m. with a coworker when she gets a text message from Braden that just kind of comes out of the blue, and it says, "I need a break from you." Now, this is around the time that they're planning their wedding. And so Renee is totally heartbroken, and she's trying to get in touch with him and call him. He's not picking up. And then fast forward to about 2:45 p.m. that afternoon, we know Renee called Goulburn Prison. It was the first time she had done that. Now, we don't know who she spoke to or what they actually talked about, but it's nearly guaranteed that she learned Braden Spiteri was not being held for. And so almost certainly she would have realized that Braden is either not real or Braden had been lying to her in such a huge way that the relationship could never work. And so no matter what, this chapter of her life was totally over. And so later that day, when she was sitting on her bed in her bedroom and her mom came in and she asked her how she was doing, it's very likely that Renee was devastated. She was crushed and probably kind of embarrassed about how badly she'd just been duped by this Braden person, whoever that was. And so even though normally Renee would tell her mother everything, her mother was her confidant, she loved her mother, it was like she just couldn't bring herself to discuss what was happening to her. It was just so enormous, it was so overwhelming that she hid it from her mother. And instead, she just got dressed up, said goodbye to her mom, and then she headed out to the cliffs. No charges were ever brought against Camilla because catfishing, which is exactly what she was doing, which is using a fictitious online persona to lure people into relationships, well, that's not considered a crime in Australia. And Camilla, despite being pressed by the police and Renee's family, has never taken responsibility for this and has never apologized. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please ask the like button to be the back half of your two-person horse costume for Halloween. And after they accept, spend the night before drinking Miller Lite and eating falafel. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast where we put out brand new, never before heard content on Monday mornings. And also on Thursday, we re-upload YouTube content, but we remastered the audio. This podcast is called Mr. Ballin Podcast, and you can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, basically anywhere you find your podcasts, it will be there. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform. My username on all of them is @MrBallin, and then just send me a direct message. I actually do read the bulk of my messages. We have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is just called Mr. Ballin Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes, and the other YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballin en Español, and it's a Spanish language channel. We also have a Facebook page just called @Mr. Ballin that puts out near daily content. We also have a Snapchat channel called Mr. Ballin that puts out content on Sundays. We have some really cool merchandise. If you want to check it out, go to shopmrballin.com, and if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, podcasts, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
卡迪娜现在登录发票，万点 Live Points 立即抽。
See if maybe he showed up. But the following morning, when Nikolai... Today's story sounds exactly like an urban legend. It sounds too exaggerated, too grotesque, too terrifying to be real. But it is. This is the true story of the Bitsevki Park maniac. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to help build the Like Button's new dresser they just got from IKEA. As soon as you open it up, immediately find all the screws, strip them all, and then leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. Moscow, Russia, which is one of the world's richest cities, is home to more billionaires than any other European city. But if you travel just 10 miles south of Moscow's richest neighborhood, the Golden Mile, you will reach one of Russia's poorest neighborhoods, the southern Moscow suburbs. Nicknamed Zhopamira, which means the soul of the world, these suburbs used to be a thriving neighborhood with tens of thousands of working-class Russians and their families calling it their home. But after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the money and the jobs in this area dried up completely, and even though the residents wanted to relocate and live somewhere with more opportunity, they couldn't. They didn't have the resources to leave, and so they were trapped. And since 1991, really nothing has changed in these suburbs. Today, there are still tens of thousands of now very poor Russian families that still live there, living in these totally overcrowded Soviet apartment buildings that are these big, square, identical-looking things that are literally falling apart. And most of the people who live in these suburbs either are unemployed or they work some dead-end job that barely pays them any money. The police in the suburbs are completely underfunded and, for the most part, are corrupt. And so crime over the years has really taken a dramatic uptick. Also, drug and alcohol abuse are completely running rampant in this part of the world. But despite their notoriously rough living situation in the southern Moscow suburbs, these residents do have one claim to fame, and that is the BTFO Park. BTFO Park is comprised primarily of a massive, lush green forest that is full of wildlife and beautiful streams and clearings, and it sits right on the southern edge of the southern Moscow suburbs. In total, the park covers a whopping 2,700 acres and stretches 4 miles from top to bottom, which makes it 3 times bigger than New York City's famous Central Park. BTFO Park had always been a popular tourist destination for people living around Moscow, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, the park's popularity skyrocketed, specifically amongst people that lived in the southern Moscow suburbs. As their lives continued to become more bleak in the 1990s, they compensated by going to the park as much as they possibly could. They would take long walks in the woods, they would play chess with their friends along the peripheries on the park benches and tables, or they'd go cross-country skiing in the winter. Basically, year-round, this park became their escape from their miserable everyday lives. But that would not last. Starting in the early 2000s, something totally unexplainable and terrifying began happening in the park, specifically in the heavily forested area in the park. And eventually, this unusual event that was taking place, got so completely out of hand that the residents of the southern Moscow suburbs stopped going in the park. They were literally too scared to go inside. The strange phenomenon began in 2001. From May to July that year, 10 people went missing after having been spotted either in or right around the outside of the heavily forested area inside of BTFO Park. All of them were alone when they were last spotted, and all of them were men. Now, there was some precedent for people suddenly going missing in this part of Russia. Every now and again, people would try to flee these suburbs to try to make a better life for themselves somewhere else, but time and time again, they would just come back a couple of days or weeks later because it hadn't worked out. But when these 10 men did not come back in a couple of days or weeks, their families went to police and reported them missing. But unsurprisingly, the police did not launch an investigation. Instead, they accused the 10 missing men of just being drunk bums who probably wandered off somewhere, and whatever trouble they were in, it was their fault. Now, the families and the locals did not buy this explanation, but there really wasn't a better explanation. These men really had just kind of vanished. No one had any idea where they went. And so given the kind of general grim outlook on life that lots of people held in this area, people just kind of accepted that whatever happened to these 10 men happened and there's nothing any of us can do about it. And they moved on.